So the brain is the most metabolically hungry organ in the body. Despite accounting for only 2 to 3% of your body's mass, accounts for 25% of your basal metabolic rate. So 25% of all the food that you eat, 25% of every breath you take is going to support energy creation in the brain, where the brain is a ravenous energy consumer. And we're starting to see that the same way that the body, that there can be essentially gridlock in the body with regard to energy generation, the same thing can occur in the brain, and in fact does seem to occur in the brain in pathological states such as Alzheimer's disease, which is sort of like the worst possible brain health outcome, right? So in the Alzheimer's riddled brain, the brain's ability to create energy from glucose, which is its primary energy substrate, is diminished by about 50%, which again, just kind of underscoring how important energy is for the brain. It's not happenstance that the brain is responsible for 25% of your basal metabolic rate. It's like the body has evolved to walk the brain around, essentially. It is, in a way, the most important organ in the body. Yeah. And it's incredibly energy hungry. And so, any impairment in the brain's ability to create energy is going to create problems. And we actually see there are brain scans that suggest that people who are genetically predisposed to developing Alzheimer's disease actually have a very slight reduction in their ability to generate glucose from across the age spectrum. And so how do we prevent Alzheimer's disease? Well, it seems that the body's overall metabolic health is related to the metabolic health of the brain, which kind of makes intuitive sense, but of course it's always good to have data. And so we see that the degree of insulin resistance in the body is actually related quite strongly to the degree of what's referred to as glucose hypometabolism in the brain.
Right.
And this is to the degree that Alzheimer's disease is now being referred to by some as type 3 diabetes, a form of diabetes of the brain. So it's really important, all the pieces are still being put together. The brain uses insulin, but in ways that are different than perhaps the periphery. So we're still trying to piece all the parts together. But there are some studies that indicate that when you supply the brain with an alternate fuel source, such as ketone bodies, whether by way of nutritional ketosis from a ketogenic diet or with these sort of ketogenic supplements, that there's and particularly earlier in the progression of Alzheimer's disease, there seems to be a very slight cognitive improvement. And what ketones are doing is ketones are supplying energy to the brain. So it seems that there's this energetic, to borrow Chris Palmer's catchphrase, brain energy problem with regard to Alzheimer's disease. And this is actually something that I spotlighted in my book, 5 years ago in Genius Foods. And so, yeah, we definitely want to be mindful of the metabolic health of the body. And today, about 9 in 10 adults have some component of metabolic illness. So it's just a crazy, sad situation. And I think it's the standard American food diet, which I think plays a large role in this, but it's also the lifestyle. We're chronically stressed, we're chronically underslept, we're chronically sedentary. None of these things are positive from the standpoint of metabolic health.
Yeah. I don't know if you've talked to Ben Bickman. I assume you probably have, but he has done a lot in to study hippocampal tissue in the brain of Alzheimer's patients. And what he was finding is exactly what you just outlined, is that there's essentially in hippocampal cells, they become insulin resistant. So there's basically glucose metabolism dysfunction that's happening there. But then accompanying that is hyperinsulinemia, so high levels of insulin. And with high levels of insulin, your body's not going to produce the ketones. So your brain is basically just doesn't have either substrate available to it. So what's it going to do? It's going to start to contract. And so this is, we're seeing, dementia rates that are just like off the charts right now. So this is a big deal.
It's a huge deal. I mean, if you are, and just to put sort of statistics to this, if you're a type 2 diabetic, your risk for developing Alzheimer's disease. Alzheimer's disease increases between 2 and 4-fold. So you are at the very least doubling your risk for the development of Alzheimer's disease if you're a type 2 diabetic. And so many people today are struggling from type 2 diabetes, pre-diabetes. The majority of people with pre-diabetes don't even know that they have it.
Right.
And so it's a huge public health problem. There you go.
I was one of them. Yeah, I was one of them. You brought up a term, the core metabolic rate, at one juncture, and I think it's important to maybe unpack that for people because obviously the development of muscle helps to increase that core metabolic rate where you're just like literally just sitting around watching Curb Your Enthusiasm. You're burning more calories if you have more muscle than you otherwise would be. Can you unpack core metabolic rate for us?
Yeah, so your body has to maintain what's called homeostasis. Your body has a general burn rate at which it goes through energy. And just sitting on your couch, no matter who you are, you're burning a certain amount of calories just to sustain the many processes that are occurring in your body, which we call whole life. You're a living, breathing entity. Yeah. Things are happening. Even when, yes, you're just sitting on the couch watching Curb Your Enthusiasm reruns. Which I've done, which I've spent many a night doing.
I know. I need an Excel sheet on how many calories I've burned watching Larry David stuff and shit.
I mean, I'm sure laughing increases that calorie significantly. But yeah, you don't really have, there are a few ways to increase your metabolic rate. Having more muscle in your body is one of them. It's not a huge margin, and it's difficult. Muscle accrual, particularly for the person who's been training, a trained individual, it's pretty difficult to do, which is why, I hear women still, and this is thankfully becoming less of a concern at the population level, but women, there's this concern that resistance training is going to make them bulky, which is not the case. I mean, I've been training for 30 years at this point, and I'm trying to get bulk. Like, I'm still trying to chase gains every day. Right. It's just not easy, But yes, so with building muscle is a very energy expensive tissue, and it burns calories just sitting on your body. And this is one of the reasons why when you are sedentary and you're in a calorie deficit, so if you actually are on bed rest and you're not eating, muscle wasting is a massive concern because muscle is incredibly energy expensive. It's like the first tissue to go, really, if your body thinks that you're at risk of starving to death.
Yeah, I think it was on your podcast that I heard. So we hear about sarcopenia, sort of the loss of muscle mass, and I think that's 10% every decade. So on average, maybe 1% a year. But after a fall, let's say, if you're not able to like grab something and support yourself, and you fall and, heaven forbid, break a hip or sustain some other form of injury, I think it was on your podcast that I hear you could lose like 2 pounds of muscle per week in that bed rest period. And that is really significant.
Yeah, I don't remember the exact figures, but it's a real concern. And conversely, I think it's important for people to know that resistance training with adequately intense stimulus is the best way to preserve muscle, to keep muscle when in a calorie deficit. So a lot of people who are looking to lose weight today, which is a noble goal, I mean, today we're trending towards 1 in 2 people being not just overweight, but obese. Losing fat is an incredibly worthwhile goal, I think, for most people. And even if you're not overweight, aesthetics matter, I think. And so, some people might want to lose a little bit of fat before the next bathing suit season. And so I think no matter who you are, no matter where you are in your health journey, it's really important to note that if you're in a calorie deficit, which is a catabolic state, when you're burning more calories on a 24-hour period than you're ingesting, resistance training, giving your muscles adequate anabolic stimulus with resistance training is the best way to signal to your body that we need to hold on to the muscle, right? Mm-hmm. Whereas inactivity, bed rest, for example, while being in a catabolic state, a calorie deficit, is your body's going to get rid of the muscle because it's so energy expensive.
Yeah, I think this is one of the concerns around some of these semaglutide
Yes.
drugs like Ozempic is that, I mean, it's kind of early days, so we don't really have our thumb on the data 100%, but it seems like that weight loss, Ozempic-induced weight loss seems to catabolize a lot of muscle. And obviously, there's probably some noble uses of it in cases that are quite acute. But just as a general practice, it seems like there is this tension there between weight loss, healthy weight loss, and I think it actually has to do more with the framing, which I think you've been so good at, is that maybe we shouldn't really worry as much about being overweight. We should really reframe the conversation as being under-muscled. Because it's not really the weight loss per se all the time. It's really just the lack of muscle.
Yeah, so many people, I mean, normal weight metabolic obesity is a real thing. In fact, that's probably what you suffered from, right? Because you've never, I mean, I've known you for years, and I would never take you, at least from an optics standpoint, to be somebody suffering from metabolic illness, but clearly you were. And so I think this is you can.
Well, I wore baggy shirts.
You can.
I had like dad bod underneath.
Wow.
Yeah.
So that, I mean, you were skinny fat essentially. Which is what that is. You were under muscled. You were over fat. That is right there. That's the archetype. And so that is. I mean, you're welcoming in metabolic illness by being under muscled, and that clearly illustrates right there why weight is not the end-all be-all, because by beginning a resistance training regimen, particularly if you're undertrained or if you've detrained, you will gain weight. You will likely gain weight. You'll see the scale inch upwards, but that's like healthy weight, because you're in that setting, you're putting on muscle, and that's super, super important.
Yeah. One more attribute of muscle to extol before we maybe explore how we actually put it on. I've been hearing more and more about muscle as an endocrine organ. So as a sort of producer of hormones or molecules like myokines. Yeah. I don't really know what those do or what they are. I've heard them framed as like hope molecules, and there's a bunch of like some woo-woo around it. I don't know. Do you have any sense of, from an endocrine perspective, if muscle is useful?
Yeah, I mean, there are countless hormones and myokines, and I certainly don't. I couldn't name them all. I don't know anybody who could. But myo is the suffix myo means muscle. Kines are basically, like, you've heard of cytokines, signaling molecules in the body. And so when you're contracting your muscle, when you're building muscle, your muscles are releasing certain chemicals into circulation. And one myokine that I am familiar with because of its role in brain health is BDNF, or brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which actually is released by muscle and I believe can cross the blood-brain barrier, where it acts sort of like a Miracle-Gro protein in the brain. But also even in periphery, I mean, you have like nerves, right, running throughout your body. Right. BDNF is a protein that literally it exists its role is to support the survival of existing neurons and to promote the growth of new ones. So it's like this Miracle-Gro protein that we see is stimulated by all types of exercise. We used to think that it was primarily aerobic exercise, but now we're starting to see data to support that it's also released with resistance training, which is fantastic.
Yeah. And it's so encouraging also because for decades we were told that the brain basically just goes into decline at age 25. You can't make any more neurons and you're just sort of doomed to this kind of limping through the last half century of your life. But now with kind of neuroplasticity, we're learning that, you actually not only can you maintain optimal neural activity, but it seems like you can actually grow new neurons, particularly through BDNF. So it's amazing.
Yeah, and BDNF is also compromised in disease states like Alzheimer's disease, where I believe it's also reduced. I know it's reduced, and also depression, which is very interesting. I think by about 50%, according to some indices. So BDNF is thought to be this highly benevolent growth protein that's primarily stimulated with exercise. I think there are some nutrients that can also stimulate it, like DHA fat.
Right.
But yeah, exercise is probably the best way.
Hey, thanks for watching. If you like this interview from the Commune podcast, then click subscribe and check out this video right here.